In the summer of 1940, in a small military camp nestled in the hills of northwest Georgia, something happened that would challenge everything Americans believed about war, about enemies, and about the nature of mercy itself. 127 German women sat down to eat dinner. They were prisoners of war, captured, defeated, the enemy. What was placed before them would break them in ways no battlefield ever could. Not torture, not interrogation, not punishment. Steak, mashed potatoes, fresh bread with butter, coffee with real cream. And when these women tasted it, when they lifted forks to mouths and chewed and swallowed, they began to cry. Not quiet tears, not dignified weeping. They sobbed. They shook. They covered their faces with trembling hands and wept like children who had suddenly remembered what it meant to be human. Why? Why would food, simple food, destroy women who had survived bombings, survived interrogations, survived the complete collapse of their country? The answer reveals something profound about America, about mercy, about the strange alchemy that happens when enemies stop being abstractions and become people sitting across from you at a dinner table. This is the story of Fort Oglethorpe, of German prisoners and American soldiers, of hatred that transformed into something else entirely when it collided with unexpected kindness. It is a story most Americans have never heard, and once you hear it, you will never forget it. To understand what happened in that mess hall, we must first understand who these women were. Not the propaganda version, not the enemy caricature, the truth. By 1944, Nazi Germany was desperate. The war had consumed an entire generation of young men. Factories stood empty, communication networks broke down. The machinery of war required bodies to operate it, and the bodies of men were buried across Europe and Russia and North Africa. So Germany turned to its women, not to fight, to support, to fill the gaps left by the dead and the dying. They were called auxiliaries, secretaries who typed orders in military offices, telephone operators who connected calls between commands, nurses who bandaged wounds, clerks who filed paperwork, cooks who prepared meals, women who kept the bureaucracy of war functioning while men pulled triggers. Were they complicit in the horrors of the Third Reich? The question has no simple answer. Some believed in the cause. Some were coerced. Some were simply trying to survive in a country where refusing to serve could mean death, or worse, death for your family. Many were young, barely out of their teenage years, swept up in a machine they did not fully understand and could not escape. Among them was a woman named Elsa Schneider, 21 years old. 21 years. From Munich. Brown hair, blue eyes, hands that trembled when she was nervous, which was often. Before the war, she had dreamed of becoming a teacher. She loved poetry, especially Rilke, and spent hours in her father's small bookshop reading stories of places she hoped someday to see. The war took the bookshop. A British bombing raid in 1943 reduced it to rubble. Her father died in the debris clutching a first edition of Goethe that had been in the family for 3 generations. Elsa's mother survived, but something in her broke that night. She stopped speaking for 6 months. When she finally spoke again, her voice was different, hollow, like an echo of the woman she had been. Elsa was drafted into the Wehrmacht Communication Corps in 1944. She answered telephones. She transferred calls. She typed reports she was not allowed to read. She did not fire weapons. She did not plan attacks. She was a cog in a machine, interchangeable and insignificant. She was also terrified, confused, and utterly unprepared for what was coming. The Americans came in March 1945. By then, Germany was collapsing. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years was dying after 12. Allied forces pushed from the west. Soviet forces crushed from the east. Every day brought news of another city fallen, another army surrendered, another leader captured or killed. Elsa's unit was stationed near the Rhine when the end came. She remembered the sound first, not gunfire. Engines, dozens of them. Trucks and tanks and vehicles she could not identify, grinding toward them through the morning fog. Her commanding officer, a man named Hauptmann Weber, gathered the women in the communications center. His face was gray. His hands shook worse than Elsa's. He said, "We are surrendering. The Americans will be here within the hour. You will not resist. You will cooperate. You will survive." Then he walked to his office and shot himself. The women screamed. Some tried to run. Most simply stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. When the Americans arrived, they found 132 women standing in a muddy courtyard, hands raised, faces streaked with tears. The soldiers who found them were not much older than Elsa, boys from Ohio and Texas and California, boys who had crossed an ocean to fight monsters and found instead a group of terrified young women who looked like their sisters, their girlfriends, their neighbors. There was confusion, shouting in languages neither side fully understood. A sergeant with a thick Brooklyn accent kept yelling, ordering his men not to fire, waving his arms like he was directing traffic at a busy intersection. One American soldier, a private barely old enough to shave, looked at Elsa and said something she did not understand, but his tone was gentle, almost apologetic. Years later, she would learn what he said. They are just kids. Jesus Christ, they are just kids. The women were loaded onto trucks. 5 died during the journey, victims of illness, of shock, of wounds received in the final chaotic days of the Reich's collapse. 127 survived. They were taken first to France, then to a port city Elsa never learned the name of, then onto a ship that crossed an ocean none of them had ever seen. The Atlantic crossing took 19 days. 19 days of seasickness and fear and uncertainty. 19 days wondering if the Americans would simply drown them in the middle of the ocean. After all, that is what the propaganda had promised. Americans were barbarians, savages. They would rape and murder any German they captured. Elsa spent most of those days pressed against a bulkhead, trying not to vomit, trying not to think about what awaited her on the other side of the world. She thought about her mother, about Friedrich, her younger brother, who was fighting somewhere on the Eastern Front, about the bookshop that no longer existed, about the life she had planned and would never live. She did not think about survival. Survival seemed impossible. And then on a gray morning in May 1945, the ship docked in New York Harbor. The women were marched onto American soil. If you are watching this and wondering how this story ends, if you want to know what happened to Elsa and the women of Fort Oglethorpe, subscribe now. What comes next will challenge everything you think you know about enemies, about mercy, and about what it means to be American. Fort Oglethorpe sat in the northwest corner of Georgia, near the Tennessee border, in a region of rolling hills and thick forests and summer heat that hit like a physical force. The camp had history. It was built in 1902, named for James Oglethorpe, the British general who founded the colony of Georgia 2 centuries earlier. During World War I, it served as a training facility for American soldiers shipping out to France. Between the wars, it dozed in the southern heat, largely forgotten. Now in 1945, it had a new purpose: prisoner of war camp, holding facility for enemy combatants captured in Europe and transported across the Atlantic for secure internment. When the trucks carrying Elsa and the other women rolled through the gates on May 15, 1945, the first thing she noticed was how green everything was. Germany in 1945 was gray. Gray rubble, gray skies, gray faces. But Georgia in spring was explosively, almost violently green. Trees dripping with leaves. Grass so thick it looked painted. Flowers blooming along the fence lines in colors Elsa had forgotten existed. It was beautiful, and the beauty felt obscene. How could the world be so alive when so many people were dead? The truck stopped in a courtyard surrounded by long wooden buildings, barracks, a mess hall, an administration building flying the American flag. Guard towers at regular intervals manned by soldiers who watched with expressions Elsa could not read. A woman in uniform approached the trucks. Not military uniform, medical, a nurse perhaps, or a doctor. She was older than the soldiers, maybe 30, with auburn hair and tired eyes and a clipboard held against her chest like a shield. Her name, Elsa would learn later, was Ruth Morrison. Lieutenant Ruth Morrison, United States Army Nurse Corps. Ruth's brother had been killed at Normandy 11 months earlier. She had volunteered for this assignment because she wanted to see the enemy up close. She wanted to understand what kind of people could produce the monsters who had killed her brother. Standing in that courtyard, watching 127 exhausted and terrified women climb down from those trucks, Ruth Morrison found herself confronting a question she was not prepared to answer. These were the enemy. These gaunt, hollow-eyed girls who flinched at loud noises and clutched each other's hands and looked at her like rabbits caught in a trap. Where were the monsters? The next few hours were a blur of processing. Names taken, photographs snapped, medical examinations conducted by nurses who wore gloves and masks and kept their distance as if the prisoners carried some contagion that proximity might spread. Elsa stood in line and answered questions she barely understood. Her English was limited to a few phrases learned in school years ago. A translator, a German-American soldier from Milwaukee, conveyed her answers to the processing officer. Name Elsa Margaret Schneider, date of birth. March 7, 1924. Place of birth, Munich, Bavaria. Military rank, none. Civilian auxiliary, assignment, communication corps telephone operator. Crimes committed, none known. The processing officer stamped a form. Next, Elsa was assigned to Barracks 7, given a uniform of gray denim, assigned a bunk near a window that looked out on the perimeter fence. Her bunkmate was a woman named Greta Hoffman, 23 years old, former secretary in a supply depot near Frankfurt. Greta had a round face, a nervous laugh, and a habit of twisting her hair when anxious, which meant her hair was twisted almost constantly. That first night lying on mattresses that seemed impossibly soft after months of sleeping on floors and in trucks and on ship bunks, Elsa and Greta whispered to each other in the darkness. What do you think they will do to us? I do not know. The propaganda said they would torture us, rape us, use us for experiments. But the propaganda lied about everything else. Maybe it lied about this too. A long silence. Then Greta whispered, "Did you see the food they gave the men prisoners? The ones who arrived last week?" "Oh." "I saw them carrying trays to the male barracks. Trays with meat, real meat, and vegetables, and bread." Elsa did not respond. She could not process the information. Food was something you fought for in Germany, something you waited hours in line to receive if you received it at all. The idea of enemies giving you food, real food, seemed as impossible as the idea of the sun rising in the west. Sleep came eventually. Restless dream haunted sleep. Elsa dreamed of her father's bookshop, of shelves filled with books she had never read, of her mother's voice before the bombing, warm and full and alive. She woke at dawn to the sound of a bell. The mess hall was a long wooden building that smelled of coffee and something else. Something Elsa could not immediately identify because it had been so long since she had smelled it. Cooking meat. The women entered in single file, directed by American soldiers who spoke in calm, measured tones. Not shouting, not threatening, just directing the way you might direct guests at a gathering. Elsa found a seat at one of the long tables. Greta sat beside her. Around them, 127 women waited, uncertain, terrified of what would come next. And then the food arrived. Trays carried by American soldiers, set before each woman with a kind of casual efficiency that suggested this was nothing special, nothing remarkable, just routine. On each tray, a steak, not a sliver of meat, a steak thick and brown and sizzling with juice, mashed potatoes pale and fluffy with a pat of butter melting on top, green beans, actual vegetables cooked with bacon and onions, a roll of bread fresh, still warm from the oven, a glass of milk. Whole milk, white and cold and impossibly abundant. Elsa stared at her tray. Around her she heard sounds. Strange sounds, choking sounds, sobbing sounds. She looked up and saw women crying, not eating, crying, tears streaming down faces as they stared at food they had not seen in years, food they had dreamed about, food they had assumed they would never taste again. Greta's hands were shaking so badly she could not lift her fork. Elsa tried to speak, tried to say something comforting, but her throat had closed and her eyes were burning, and suddenly she was crying too. She picked up her knife and cut into the steak. Red juice pooled on the plate. She lifted a piece to her mouth. She chewed, she swallowed, and she broke. Not dramatically, not loudly. She simply put down her fork and covered her face with her hands and wept. Because the propaganda had promised torture. The propaganda had promised cruelty. The propaganda had promised that Americans were animals who would treat German prisoners like garbage. Instead, they were serving steak. How do you process that? How do you reconcile a lifetime of being told your enemy is a monster when that monster is setting a hot meal before you and asking if you would like more coffee? The crying spread through the mess hall like a contagion. Soon nearly every woman was weeping, some quietly, some with great heaving sobs that shook their entire bodies. The American soldiers watched, uncertain what to do. One young private looked like he might cry himself. Sergeant William Parker, a career soldier from Mississippi who had fought in North Africa and Italy, stood at the doorway and watched. He had seen men die. He had killed enemy soldiers himself. He had learned to hate Germans with a cold professional efficiency that made him effective in combat. But this was something else. These women were not soldiers. They were not threats. They were broken people far from home, destroyed not by cruelty, but by unexpected kindness. Parker did not understand it, but he felt something shift inside him. Some certainty eroding, some belief cracking. He turned and walked out into the Georgia sunshine. He needed air. He needed to think. Behind him in the mess hall, the crying continued. Ruth Morrison watched from the corner of the mess hall. She had expected many things when she volunteered for this assignment. She had expected defiance, arrogance, the cold superiority of a master race confronted by its conquerors. She had not expected this. These women, these supposed enemies, were crying over food. Crying because kindness was so foreign to them that it broke something inside. What had they been through? What kind of country produces people so conditioned to cruelty that mercy itself becomes a weapon? Ruth thought about her brother Thomas. Killed at Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944. Shot while running toward a German machine gun emplacement. 24 years old. A medical student who wanted to become a pediatrician. She had volunteered for Fort Oglethorpe because she wanted to hate. She wanted to look into the faces of the enemy and feel the righteous fury that would make her brother's death meaningful. Instead, she found herself watching a 21-year-old girl cry over mashed potatoes. Elsa Schneider. Ruth had reviewed her file. Telephone operator. No combat experience. Father killed in a bombing raid. Mother displaced. Brother missing on the Eastern Front. Just a girl. Caught in a war she never asked for, serving a regime she could not escape. Ruth walked slowly through the mess hall, pretending to inspect the tables, in reality, studying the faces around her. She saw fear, confusion, gratitude so intense it looked like pain. She did not see monsters. Near the back of the hall, Greta Hoffman had finally managed to eat. She was chewing slowly, tears still wet on her cheeks, savoring each bite as if it might be her last. Ruth stopped beside her. Through the translator, she asked, "Is the food acceptable?" Greta looked up. Her expression cycled through terror, confusion, and something else, something that might have been the beginning of trust. She said, "We have not eaten like this in years. We thought you would starve us. We thought you would punish us." Ruth nodded slowly. She said, "In America, we feed our prisoners. It is the law. It is also the right thing to do." Greta stared at her as if she had spoken in an alien language. Ruth walked away, feeling something shift inside her own chest. Some certainty cracking. Some hate softening into something more complicated. She did not know it yet, but that moment, that conversation, that meal would change her life. It would change all of their lives, because mercy once offered cannot be taken back. It plants seeds that grow in unexpected directions. It creates obligations and connections that transcend the simple categories of friend and enemy, victor and vanquished. The women of Fort Oglethorpe had expected torture and received kindness. That kindness would haunt them, transform them, and ultimately save them. But the transformation was just beginning, and the hardest moments were still to come. What happened next would test everything. Illness escape attempt, confessions that bridged the impossible gulf between enemies. The story of Fort Oglethorpe was only beginning. Subscribe now, because what comes next will restore your faith in humanity. The days following that first meal settled into a rhythm none of the women had expected. Wake at 6:30, wash, dress in the gray denim uniforms that had become strangely comfortable. Walk to the mess hall for breakfast. Breakfast was oatmeal with brown sugar, toast with butter, eggs sometimes scrambled, sometimes fried, coffee that was strong and bitter and endlessly available. Then work assignments. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war be given meaningful labor, not punishment, not degradation. Work that served the camp and gave structure to the long empty days of captivity. Elsa was assigned to the infirmary. She did not know why she was chosen. Perhaps because her file mentioned that her mother had been a nurse before the war. Perhaps because she seemed calm under pressure despite the trembling hands that betrayed her constant anxiety. Perhaps it was simply random, a bureaucratic decision made by someone who needed a body to fill a slot. Whatever the reason, Elsa found herself reporting to Lieutenant Ruth Morrison on the morning of May 17, 1945. The infirmary was a long white building that smelled of antiseptic and clean linen. 8 beds lined each wall, most of them empty. Medical supplies filled shelves along the back. A desk near the entrance held paperwork schedules, requisition forms. Ruth stood behind that desk when Elsa entered. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Ruth saw a thin young woman with haunted eyes and hands that would not stop moving. A girl who flinched when doors closed too loudly. A prisoner who expected cruelty and could not understand its absence. Elsa saw an American officer, an enemy, a woman whose country had bombed her city, killed her father, destroyed everything she had known, but also a woman who had asked if the food was acceptable, who had spoken to Greta with something approaching gentleness. The translator, a young corporal named Heinrich Muller, who had emigrated from Germany as a child, stood between them. Ruth spoke first. She said, "You will assist me in the infirmary. Your duties will include organizing supplies, maintaining cleanliness, and helping with basic patient care. You will not administer medication or perform medical procedures. You will follow my instructions exactly. Do you understand?" Elsa nodded. Ruth continued, "I expect hard work and honesty. In return, you will be treated fairly. This is not punishment. This is simply work that needs to be done. Any questions?" Elsa hesitated. Then through the translator she asked, "Why are you doing this?" Ruth's expression flickered. Something crossed her face that Elsa could not read. She said, "Because it is my job." But that was not the whole truth, and both women knew it. Huzuro to 20 Huzuro. Building trust. The first week was awkward. Elsa worked in near silence, following Ruth's instructions with meticulous precision. She organized bandages by size. She counted bottles of iodine and aspirin. She swept floors that were already clean and wiped surfaces that needed no wiping. Ruth watched her constantly, not with suspicion exactly, with something closer to curiosity, as if Elsa were a puzzle she was trying to solve. They communicated through the translator when necessary, but most of their interactions were wordless. A pointed finger indicating where supplies should go, a nod of approval when a task was completed correctly, a shake of the head when something needed to be redone. By the second week, something began to shift. Elsa noticed that Ruth arrived early every morning before the official start of the workday. She would sit at her desk with a cup of coffee reading letters that she kept in a small wooden box. Sometimes her lips moved as she read. Sometimes she wiped her eyes. One morning Elsa arrived early too. She found Ruth holding a photograph, staring at it with an expression of such raw grief that Elsa stopped in the doorway, uncertain whether to enter or retreat. Ruth looked up. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither moved. Then Ruth tucked the photograph back into the box and gestured for Elsa to come in. She said through the translator who had followed Elsa, "My brother. He was killed at Normandy last year." Elsa did not know what to say. What could she say? Her country had killed this woman's brother. Her people, her army, her side in this terrible war. She said, "I am sorry." Ruth nodded slowly. She said his name was Thomas. He wanted to be a doctor. He was 24 years old. The silence stretched between them. Then Elsa said, "My father was killed in a bombing raid. British planes. He was in his bookshop when the bombs fell." Ruth's expression shifted. Something in her eyes changed. She said, "I am sorry too." It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. But it was something, an acknowledgement that grief existed on both sides of the war. That loss did not recognize borders or uniforms, or the propaganda that painted enemies as monsters. From that day forward, something was different between them. 3 weeks into Elsa's assignment at the infirmary, Ruth asked her to stay late. The other workers had gone. The evening light slanted through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The camp was quiet, that strange stillness that settled over Fort Oglethorpe between dinner and lights out. Ruth sat at her desk. Elsa stood near the supply shelves, uncertain why she had been asked to remain. Heinrich, the translator, sat in a chair by the door. He looked tired. They all looked tired. Ruth spoke slowly, choosing her words with care. She said, "I need to tell you something, Elsa. Something I have not told anyone else here." Elsa waited. Ruth said, "When I volunteered for this assignment, I wanted to hate you. All of you. I wanted to look at German faces and feel rage. I wanted vengeance for my brother." She paused. Her hands were clasped on the desk, knuckles white. She continued, "Thomas was the kindest person I ever knew. He never hurt anyone. He wanted to spend his life helping children. And your people, your soldiers, they shot him on a beach in France while he was trying to save a wounded man. He was not even carrying a weapon. He was carrying medical supplies. Elsa felt her throat tighten. She wanted to apologize again, but the words seemed so small against the weight of what Ruth was describing. Ruth said, I came here expecting monsters. I came here ready to hate. And then I saw you. All of you, crying over food, flinching at loud noises, writing letters to mothers you might never see again. She looked directly at Elsa. She said, you are not monsters. You are people. Scared, broken people who got caught in something terrible. Just like Thomas. Just like me. Tears were streaming down Ruth's face now. She did not wipe them away. She said, I do not know how to hate you anymore. And that terrifies me. Because if I cannot hate you, then what was my brother's death for? What does any of it mean? Elsa crossed the room. She did not think about it. She did not calculate the risk or consider the propriety. She simply moved, drawn by something deeper than thought. She knelt beside Ruth's chair and took her hand. She said, I do not know what any of it means. I do not know why your brother died or why my father died or why any of this happened. But I know that hate did not save them and hate will not bring them back. Ruth looked at her. Enemy looking at enemy. Woman looking at woman. Human looking at human. She said, then what do we do? Elsa said, we survive. We remember them, and we try to be worthy of their memory. Ruth squeezed her hand. Neither woman spoke for a long time. Outside, the sun set over the Georgia hills. The guards changed shifts. The prisoners settled into their bunks. The world continued its slow rotation toward whatever came next. But in that small infirmary, something had changed. A wall had cracked. A bridge had begun to form. Ruth Morrison, who had come to hate, had found something else instead. And Elsa Schneider, who had expected torture, had found something that looked almost like friendship. Haru to 25 Hazaru, Greta's illness. The crisis came without warning. One morning in early June, Greta did not wake for the breakfast bell. Elsa found her still in her bunk, face flushed with fever, skin burning to the touch. Greta's eyes were glassy and unfocused. Her breathing came in short, shallow gasps. Elsa ran to the infirmary. Ruth took one look at Greta, and her expression went tight. She said, pneumonia. Maybe worse. Help me get her to the infirmary. Now, they carried Greta across the compound. She was so light, Elsa thought. How had she not noticed how thin her friend had become? How had she missed the signs that something was wrong? The next 72 hours were a nightmare. Greta's fever spiked. Her breathing became labored. She drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling in German, about her mother, about a garden she remembered from childhood, about a boy named Wilhelm, who had promised to marry her when the war ended. Elsa did not leave her side. Ruth worked through the night, administering medication, monitoring vital signs, doing everything in her power to keep this German prisoner alive. At one point, Sergeant Parker came to check on the situation. He stood in the doorway watching Ruth work. He said, Lieutenant, you have been awake for 36 hours. You need rest. Ruth did not look up from her patient. She said, if she dies, it will not be because I was sleeping. Parker studied her for a moment. He said, she is the enemy, Lieutenant. You know that, right? Ruth finally looked at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion, but her voice was steady. She said, she is a 23-year-old girl with pneumonia. That is all she is right now. The enemy can wait until she is better. Parker nodded slowly. He did not agree exactly, but he did not argue either. He said, let me know if you need anything. Then he left. On the third night, Greta's fever broke. Elsa was dozing in a chair beside the bed when she heard it. A change in breathing, a soft moan. She opened her eyes and found Greta looking at her. Greta whispered, Elsa, where am I? Elsa grabbed her hand. She said, you are in the infirmary. You were very sick, but you are going to be okay. Greta's eyes moved around the room, taking in the white walls, the medical equipment, the American flag hanging near the entrance. She whispered, the American nurse. She saved me. Elsa nodded. She said, Ruth, her name is Ruth. She has not slept in 3 days. She refused to leave you. Greta's face crumpled. She whispered, why I am the enemy. Why would she save me? Elsa did not have an answer, or perhaps she had too many answers and none of them fit neatly into words. She said, because she is good. Because mercy does not ask whether you deserve it. Because sometimes the enemy stops being the enemy when you see them as a person. Greta closed her eyes. Tears leaked from beneath her lashes. She whispered, I do not understand this place. I do not understand these people. We were told they would be cruel. Elsa squeezed her hand. She said, I know. I do not understand it either, but I am grateful for it. Ruth entered a few minutes later carrying fresh bandages. She saw that Greta was awake and stopped in her tracks. Her exhausted face broke into a smile. She said, Welcome back. Through the translator, Greta said, Thank you for saving my life. I do not know how to repay you. Ruth set down the bandages and sat on the edge of the bed. She said, You do not need to repay me. Just get better. And when you go home, remember that Americans are not what you were told. Remember that we are just people trying to do the right thing. Greta nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Ruth patted her hand, then stood to continue her work. But something had passed between them in that moment. Something that transcended language and nationality and all the walls that war builds between human beings. Ruth Morrison had saved a German prisoner's life, not because it was required, not because anyone was watching, but because it was the right thing to do. And that act of mercy would ripple outward in ways none of them could yet imagine. If this story is affecting you, if you are thinking about what mercy means and what it costs and whether you could have done what Ruth did, leave a comment below. Tell me, what does mercy mean to you, and subscribe, because what comes next will test everything. Not everyone at Fort Oglethorpe believed in kindness, and one woman's desperate choice will push the entire camp to the breaking point. Not every prisoner at Fort Oglethorpe responded to kindness the same way. Liesel Weber was 34 years old. She had been a true believer, a member of the Nazi Party since 1936, a woman who had genuinely embraced the ideology, who had reported neighbors for listening to forbidden radio broadcasts, who had marched in rallies and sung the songs, and truly believed that Germany was destined to rule the world. The collapse of the Reich had shattered her, not just her country, her identity, her entire understanding of reality. Everything she had believed, everything she had done, everything she had sacrificed, all of it had been for nothing. Worse than nothing. The newsreels they were shown at Fort Oglethorpe, the footage from the liberation of the concentration camps, had revealed the truth about what she had supported. Liesel could not accept it. To accept it would mean acknowledging that she was not a patriot, but a collaborator in atrocity. That her neighbors had not been criminals but victims. That her entire adult life had been built on lies. The human mind will do almost anything to avoid that kind of realization. Liesel convinced herself that it was all propaganda. American lies designed to humiliate Germany. Fake films and staged photographs meant to justify the occupation. She had to believe that. The alternative was unbearable. But the other prisoners were changing. They were accepting the kindness of their captors. They were learning English, working in the gardens, laughing at meals. They were forgetting what they were supposed to be. Liesel watched Elsa's growing friendship with Ruth and felt something twist inside her. Traitors. All of them. Weak women who had abandoned their country at the first sign of comfort. She began to plan. The night of June 28, 1945, Liesel made her move. She had been watching the guards for weeks. She knew their schedules, their patterns, the moments when attention lapsed. She had hidden supplies, civilian clothes stolen from a laundry shipment, a knife taken from the mess hall, a crude map sketched from overheard conversations. Her plan was simple: escape the camp, make her way to the coast, find passage on a ship back to Europe, return to Germany, and join the resistance she was certain still existed. It was a fantasy, a delusion born of desperation and denial. But Liesel believed it with the fervor of the true fanatic. She slipped out of the barracks at 2 in the morning. The night was warm and moonless, perfect for escape. She moved through the shadows toward the eastern fence, where she had identified a weak point near the drainage ditch. She was 30 feet from the fence when the spotlight found her. The alarm sounded. Guards shouted. Dog barked in the distance. Liesel ran. She made it to the fence. She was climbing, her fingers bleeding on the wire, when they caught her. 2 soldiers tackled her from behind. She fell hard, the wind knocked from her lungs, the knife clattering away into the darkness. She screamed. Not words, just sound. The raw animal cry of someone whose last hope has been ripped away. The soldiers pinned her down. More guards arrived. Sergeant Parker pushed through the crowd, his face grim in the floodlights. He said, "Get her to the stockade, solitary confinement until we figure out what to do with her." Liesel was dragged away, still screaming. The other prisoners watched from the barracks windows. Elsa stood among them, her heart pounding. She had known Liesel was troubled. She had seen the way she glared at anyone who showed gratitude toward the Americans. But she had not expected this. Greta stood beside her, still weak from her illness, but strong enough to witness. She whispered, "What will they do to her?" Elsa shook her head. She said, "I do not know." The escape attempt changed everything. The next morning, Sergeant Parker called an assembly. All prisoners, all guards, everyone. He stood on a small wooden platform, his face unreadable. Lieutenant Ruth Morrison stood to his left. The translator stood ready. Parker spoke. He said, "Last night, one of your number attempted to escape. She was apprehended. She is unharmed." He paused, letting the translation sink in. He continued, "I want to make something clear. This incident will not change how we operate this camp. You will continue to be fed. You will continue to receive medical care. You will continue to be treated according to the Geneva Convention and the laws of the United States Army." A murmur rippled through the prisoners. Parker held up his hand. He said, "However, escape attempts cannot be tolerated. They endanger everyone, prisoners and guards alike. The woman who attempted escape will remain in solitary confinement for 30 days. This is the standard punishment. It is not cruelty. It is discipline." He looked out at the assembled prisoners. He said, "I know that some of you were taught to see us as enemies. I know that your government told you we were monsters. I cannot force you to change your beliefs. But I can show you through our actions that what you were told was wrong. We are soldiers. We follow orders. And our orders are to treat you with dignity, regardless of what your orders might have been regarding us." He stepped down from the platform. The assembly was dismissed. Later that day, Ruth came to the infirmary where Elsa was working. She looked troubled. Elsa asked, "What will really happen to Liesel?" Ruth sighed. She said 30 days in solitary, basic rations, no privileges. Then she returns to the general population. Elsa shook her head. She said 30 days. In Germany, for attempting to escape, she would have been shot. Ruth nodded slowly. She said, "I know. Parker knows too. That is why he made the speech. He wants you all to understand that we are different, that we do not solve problems with bullets when there are other options." Elsa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is it hard being kind to people who might hate you?" Ruth considered the question. She said, "Yes, it is the hardest thing I have ever done. Every day I look at you and I think about Thomas. I think about the soldiers who killed him. I think about whether kindness is weakness." She paused. She said, "But then I think about what Thomas would want. He was going to be a doctor. He wanted to heal people, all people, not just Americans. If he were here, he would be doing exactly what I am doing." Her voice caught. She said, "So I do it for him. Because hate is easy, anyone can hate. But choosing mercy, choosing kindness, when you have every right to be cruel, that takes strength. And I want to be strong enough to honor my brother's memory." Elsa reached out and took Ruth's hand. She said, "You are strong. You are the strongest person I have ever met." Ruth smiled, though her eyes were wet. She said, "Some days I am not so sure, but thank you for saying it." They stood together in the quiet infirmary, two women from opposite sides of a war that had consumed the world. Outside, the sun moved across the Georgia sky. The guards walked their rounds. The prisoners went about their daily routines. And somewhere in a solitary cell, Liesel Weber sat in darkness, her beliefs crumbling around her, beginning the long and painful process of confronting who she had been and who she might yet become. The transformation was not complete. The hardest moments were still ahead. But something had shifted at Fort Oglethorpe. A community was forming out of chaos. Trust was building where there had been only fear. And the seeds of mercy planted in those first meals and nurtured through crisis after crisis were beginning to grow. What happens when the war officially ends, when these women must return to a Germany that no longer exists, when enemies who have become friends must say goodbye forever? Part 3 will bring this story to its conclusion. A reunion 40 years in the making, a legacy that changed thousands of lives, and a final message about what it means to choose mercy when hate would have been easier. Subscribe now. You will not want to miss how this ends. While the women of Fort Oglethorpe wrestled with impossible questions about loyalty and mercy, Something equally profound was happening on the other side of the fence. The Americans were changing too. Private Jimmy Sullivan sat on his bunk in the guards' barracks, writing a letter home to his mother in Boston. He was 19 years old, fresh-faced. He had not seen combat. This was supposed to be easy duty: guard prisoners, follow regulations, go home when the war ended. But nothing about this was easy anymore. He wrote, "Ma, you asked me what the German prisoners are like. I thought they would be monsters. That is what we were told. But they are just people, scared people, far from home, just like us. One of them, Elsa, she is about my age, works in the infirmary, never hurt anyone, just answered phones for the Wehrmacht. How am I supposed to hate her? How am I supposed to see her as the enemy when she thanks me in broken English for bringing coffee? When she shows me pictures of her brother who is missing somewhere in France?" He paused, pen hovering over the paper. What he did not write was the harder truth, that sometimes late at night he wondered if he had been lied to. Not about the war. The war was real. The atrocities were real. But about the people, about who deserved mercy and who did not. Sergeant William Parker felt it too. He had been at Kasserine Pass in North Africa. He had seen good men die. He had killed German soldiers himself, watched them fall, heard them cry for their mothers in a language he did not understand. And now he was feeding their daughters steak. The contradiction did not sit easy. One evening he stood outside the mess hall watching through the window as the women ate. Elsa was laughing at something Greta had said, actually laughing, a sound he had not heard in weeks. Corporal Danny Hewitt, the cook, came up beside him. Danny said, "They seem almost normal, do they not?" Parker nodded slowly. He said, "That is what bothers me. Makes it harder to remember they are the enemy." Danny asked, "Are they? I mean, the war is over. Germany surrendered. At what point do they stop being the enemy and start being just people we are responsible for?" Parker did not have an answer, because the truth was, mercy complicates everything. Hatred is simple. It gives you clear lines, easy categories, reasons to act without thinking. But once you feed someone, once you save their life, once you see them as human, you cannot unsee it. And that changes you in ways no battle ever could. 37 Hajro to 40 Town. Elsa's daily routine and growing comfort. By late August 1945, Fort Oglethorpe had settled into a rhythm that felt less like imprisonment and more like an uncomfortable peace. Elsa's mornings began with the clang of the wake-up bell at 6:30, but instead of dread, she felt something closer to routine. She would wash her face in cold water dress in the clean denim work clothes that had become familiar and join the others for breakfast. Oatmeal with brown sugar, toast with real butter, coffee so strong it made her wince, but coffee nonetheless. She worked in the infirmary from 8 to noon. Ruth had taught her how to sterilize instruments properly, how to organize supplies, how to recognize the signs of infection or fever. It was almost like nursing school, except her teacher was supposed to be her enemy. At lunch, she sat with Greta and the others. They spoke less about the war, now less about home. Instead, they talked about small things. The weather, the movie they had been allowed to watch last week, the letter from the Red Cross that arrived yesterday. Afternoons, Elsa helped in the garden. The Georgia heat was oppressive, but there was something honest about working with soil, about planting seeds and watching things grow, about creating instead of destroying. Private Jimmy Sullivan often worked nearby. His German had improved remarkably. He would ask, "Wie geht es dir?" Elsa would reply, "Gut danke," and she would smile despite herself. They had developed a strange friendship built on hand gestures and broken language, and the universal understanding that young people caught in old men's wars deserve kindness when they could get it. One day, Jimmy showed her a letter from his mother. Mrs. Sullivan had sent a care package. Inside were chocolate bars, cookies, and a note. Through the camp translator, the note read, "For the German girls, may they find peace." Elsa stared at the cookies, homemade, wrapped carefully in wax paper. An American mother in Boston had baked for German prisoners she had never met. The absurdity of it made her laugh, then cry, then laugh again. Because how do you process that? How do you reconcile a world where enemies bake for each other? Even Liesel was changing. She had emerged from solitary confinement, thinner, quieter, something broken behind her eyes. But the breaking had also opened something. She no longer glared at the Americans. She no longer muttered about resistance and propaganda. One evening, Elsa found her sitting alone near the garden watching the sunset. Elsa sat beside her. They did not speak for a long time. Finally, Liesel said, "I spent my whole life believing things that were not true. I reported my neighbors. I thought I was serving my country, and it was all lies." Her voice cracked. She said, "How do I live with that? How do I become someone else when everything I was turned out to be monstrous?" Elsa did not have an answer, but she took Liesel's hand. She said, "You start by admitting it. Then you try to do better, one day at a time, one choice at a time. That is all any of us can do." Liesel nodded slowly. She said, "The Americans. They could have let me die in that cell. They could have beaten me for trying to escape. Instead, they gave me food and water and left me alone with my thoughts. And my thoughts were worse than any punishment they could have invented." She looked at Elsa. She said, "I do not know who I am anymore. But maybe that is the first step. Maybe you have to lose yourself before you can find something better." Sidrum to 42 ever. Story spike number 4, The Announcement, September 4th, 1945. The announcement came during morning roll call. Sergeant Parker stood before the assembled prisoners, his face unreadable. Lieutenant Chen, the translator, stood beside him. Parker said, "Ladies." He waited for the translation. He continued, "The war is officially over. Germany has signed the surrender. Japan has surrendered. The Allied powers are beginning repatriation procedures for prisoners of war." The German words echoed through the courtyard. A murmur rippled through the women. Parker continued, "You will be returning to Germany. Ships are being prepared. Departure is expected within 4 to 6 weeks. You will be given documents, travel papers, and provisions for the journey. You will be treated according to international law throughout the repatriation process." Silence. Then somewhere in the crowd, someone started crying. Not tears of joy, not tears of grief, just tears. Elsa felt her knees weaken. Greta steadied her. Greta whispered, "We are going home." But Elsa could not speak, because home meant returning to a country that no longer existed. Home meant facing whatever remained of Munich. Home meant finding out if Friedrich was alive or dead. Home meant explaining to her mother why she had survived when so many had not. And strangest of all, home meant leaving this place, this prison that had shown her more humanity than her own government ever had. The final weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and strange emotions. The women were given medical examinations, documentation photographs for their repatriation papers. They packed their few possessions into small canvas bags issued by the Red Cross. Elsa owned almost nothing. The clothes on her back, a letter from Ruth folded carefully and tucked in her pocket, a photograph Jimmy had taken of her and Greta in the garden, smiling in the Georgia sun. That photograph would become one of her most treasured possessions. Ruth called Elsa to the infirmary one afternoon, 3 days before departure. She said, "I wanted to give you something." She handed Elsa a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages blank. Ruth explained, "For your story, so you do not forget, so you can tell others." Elsa held the journal like it might break. She asked in her careful English, why you helped so much?" Ruth smiled. That sad, tired smile Elsa had come to know. She said, "Because if I let hate decide who deserves kindness, then the people who started this war have won. They wanted us to see each other as monsters. I refused to let them be right." She paused. She said, "You are young, Elsa. You have your whole life ahead. Do not let this war define you. Do not let what you have lost make you bitter. Use what you have learned here. Show others that enemies can become something else when we choose mercy." Elsa nodded, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to say so much, to explain how Ruth had changed everything, how this place had shattered her understanding of the world, how she would never forget. Instead, she managed 3 words. She said, "I will remember." Ruth pulled her into a hug. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough. September 28, 1945. Dawn broke cool and clear over Fort Oglethorpe. The trucks waited at the main gate, engines idling. 127 women stood in formation for the last time, their small bags at their feet. The American soldiers who had guarded them for 6 months stood at attention, not as conquerors, not as captors, just as people saying goodbye to other people they had come to know. Sergeant Parker stepped forward. He said, "Ladies, you came here as prisoners of war. You leave as Will you leave as people we have had the privilege of knowing? Safe travels. May you find your families whole. May you find your country healing. And may you never forget that even in war, humanity survives. Through the translation, several women wiped their eyes. Elsa looked around one last time. The barracks where she had slept. The mess hall where she had cried over steak. The infirmary where she had learned that enemies could be healers. The garden where she had laughed with Jimmy Sullivan. She tried to memorize every detail. Ruth stood near the infirmary waving. Elsa waved back. She mouthed Danke. Jimmy ran up at the last moment, pressing something into her hand. A small American flag, the kind children waved at parades. He said in careful German, "Remember us. Remember we are not all bad." Elsa clutched the flag. She said, "I could never forget." The trucks rumbled to life. The women climbed aboard. The gates of Fort Oglethorpe opened for the last time. As the trucks pulled away, Elsa watched through the canvas flap as the camp grew smaller and smaller behind her. She was leaving a prison. But it felt like leaving home. The journey back to Europe took 3 weeks. First by train to the East Coast, then by ship across an Atlantic that seemed grayer and colder than it had 6 months before. This time the women were not afraid. They were grieving for the country they were returning to, for the people they had lost, for the innocence they had left behind when the war began. But they were also carrying something new, a memory of kindness that contradicted everything they had been taught. Elsa stood on the deck one evening, watching the sun set over the ocean. Greta joined her wrapped in a wool blanket. Greta asked, "What will you tell people about Fort Oglethorpe?" Elsa thought for a long moment. She said the truth, that we were treated better by our enemies than by our own government, that an American nurse saved your life, that an American grandmother sent cookies, that a 19-year-old boy from Boston became my friend. Greta said softly, "They will not believe you." Elsa said, "I know, but I will tell them anyway. Because if we do not, if we stay silent, then the hatred wins. And I refuse to let it win." Greta nodded, understanding. Ahead of them, the coast of Europe appeared on the horizon, a thin, dark line between sea and sky. They were going home. But home would never be the same. October 15th, 1945, Munich. The city Elsa had left 6 months earlier no longer existed. What remained was rubble. Block after block of shattered buildings, their walls torn open like wounds. The smell of dust and decay hung in the air. People moved through the streets like ghosts, gaunt and hollow-eyed. The truck dropped Elsa at what used to be the city center. She stood there, turning slowly, trying to orient herself. Nothing looked familiar. The landmarks she had known her entire life were gone. A woman approached, elderly, leaning on a cane. She asked, "Are you looking for someone?" Elsa said, "Frau Schneider?" "Elizabeth Schneider, my mother. She was in the refugee camp on Goethestrasse." The woman's face softened with recognition and sadness. She said the camp moved to the old school building, 3 blocks that way. Elsa walked through the ruins of her city, past the skeleton of the opera house where she had seen her first performance, past the church where her grandmother was buried, now missing its roof, past the bakery where her father had bought bread every Sunday morning, now just a pile of bricks. The refugee camp was chaos. Hundreds of people crammed into a building meant for children. The smell of unwashed bodies and sickness. The sound of coughing, crying, arguing. Elsa moved through the crowd looking for her mother. And then she saw her. A woman so thin Elsa almost did not recognize her. Gray hair where there had been brown. Lines carved deep into her face. Wearing a coat too large for her shrunken frame. Elsa whispered, "Mutter." The woman turned. Her eyes, still the same blue Elsa remembered, widened. She said, "Elizabeth." They fell into each other's arms. Elsa's mother sobbed, clutching her daughter like she might vanish. Elsa cried too, feeling her mother's bones through the coat, understanding without words how much she had suffered. Finally, they pulled apart. Elsa asked the question she had been dreading. She said, "Friedrich." Her mother shook her head. She said, "Still missing." "I have heard nothing since March." The weight of it settled over Elsa. Her brother somewhere in a mass grave, or a prison camp, or simply forgotten in the chaos of millions of dead. Her mother asked, "Where were you?" "The Red Cross said you were in America," Elsa said, "in a prison camp in Georgia." Her mother's expression hardened. She asked, "Were they cruel?" Elsa paused. How could she explain? She said no, mutter. They were kind. They fed us, gave us medicine, treated us like human beings. Her mother stared at her, uncomprehending. She said, I do not understand. Elsa whispered, neither did I. But it is true, and it changes everything. If this story has moved you, if you have found yourself thinking about mercy, about the cost of hatred, about the power of choosing kindness even toward enemies, please share this video. Leave a comment telling me, what does mercy mean to you? What would you have done in Elsa's place, in Ruth's place, and subscribe, because we are not done yet. Elsa's story does not end here. What she does next, how she carries this experience forward, and the impact it has decades later, will restore your faith in humanity's ability to heal. Stay with me for the final chapter. The years after the war were hard. Germany was divided. Food was scarce. The work of rebuilding was overwhelming. Elsa found work as a translator for the American occupation forces. Her English learned from Ruth and Jimmy made her valuable. She helped Germans navigate the new bureaucracy. She helped Americans understand the people they were governing. But more than that, she told her story. At first, people did not want to hear it. They were too focused on survival, too angry about defeat, too unwilling to admit that the Americans might have been more humane than their own government. But Elsa persisted. In 1950, she wrote a letter to Ruth. She had kept the address Jimmy had given her. She did not know if it would reach her. It did. Ruth's response came 3 months later, forwarded through military channels, then the Red Cross, then the German Postal Service. It was crumpled and worn, but Elsa read it with trembling hands. Ruth wrote, Dear Elsa, of course I remember you. I think of you often. I am so glad you made it home safely. I am a doctor now in Knoxville, Tennessee. Married 3 children. I tell them about you sometimes. About the scared young woman who became brave. I hope you are healing. I hope Germany is healing. The world needs people like you, Elsa. People who remember that enemies can become friends when we choose mercy over hate. Write to me. Tell me about your life. I would like to stay in touch. With love, Ruth. And so began a correspondence that would last 40 years. In 1955, Elsa became a teacher, English and history at a gymnasium in Munich. She taught her students about the war, yes, but not just the battles and the dates. She taught them about humanity, about choices, about the difference between propaganda and truth. One day a student asked Frau Schneider, did you ever meet any Americans during the war? Elsa smiled. She said, I was a prisoner in an American camp for 6 months. The class went silent. A student asked, were they cruel to you? Elsa said, no. They treated me better than I had any right to expect, better in some ways than my own country had treated me. She pulled out the journal Ruth had given her, now filled with her handwriting. Stories, memories, lessons. She said, this is from the nurse who saved my friend's life. Her brother died fighting Germany, but she still chose to save us. That is what I want you to understand, that even in war we have choices. And the choice to show mercy even to enemies is the hardest and most important choice of all. In 1908, 40 years after the war ended, Elsa did something she had dreamed about for decades. She saved enough money to fly to America. She was 61 years old, gray-haired, carrying the weight of a life lived through Germany's darkest century. Ruth met her at the airport in Knoxville. She was 72 using a cane, but her smile was exactly as Elsa remembered. They stared at each other for a long moment. Across 4 decades, across the ocean, across everything that had tried to keep them apart. Then they embraced, crying like they were 21 and 32 again in a prison camp that had become the place where hatred died. Ruth whispered, you came. Elsa said, I promised I would remember. How could I not come? They spent 2 weeks together. Ruth showed Elsa her clinic, her family, the mountains of Tennessee. Elsa told Ruth about her life in Munich, about teaching about the students who were building a new Germany. One evening, sitting on Ruth's porch, watching fireflies blink in the gathering dark, Ruth asked a question that had haunted her for decades. She said, do you think it mattered what we did at Fort Oglethorpe? Does anyone remember? Does anyone care? Elsa took her hand. She said, every student I have taught for 30 years knows the story. Every one of them learned that enemies can be human, that mercy is stronger than hate, that we always have a choice. So yes, Ruth, it mattered. You changed my life. And through me, you have changed thousands of others. Ruth wiped her eyes. She said, I am glad. I am so glad. They sat together in the darkness, two old women who had once been enemies, who had become friends, who had proven that the walls between human beings are never as solid as they seem. Ruth Morrison Keller passed away in 2005 at the age of 92. Elsa spoke at her funeral, told the story one more time to a chapel full of strangers who had never heard it before. She said, Ruth Morrison saved my life. Not because I was wounded, not because I was sick, but because she saw me as a person when I had forgotten that I was one. She showed me that mercy is not weakness. It is the greatest strength a human being can possess. She paused, looking out at the faces before her. She said I was the enemy. My country killed her brother, and she chose to save me anyway. That choice echoed across 60 years. It changed who I became. It changed what I taught. It changed thousands of lives that Ruth never knew about. That is what mercy does. It multiplies, it spreads, it outlasts the hate that tried to prevent it. Elsa Schneider lived until 2018. She was 94 years old. Until her final days, she kept Ruth's letters in a box by her bed. She kept the journal. She kept the small American flag Jimmy Sullivan had given her. Her obituary in the Munich newspaper mentioned her decades of teaching, but it also mentioned Fort Oglethorpe. It mentioned Ruth. It mentioned the truth she had spent her life telling, that enemies do not have to stay enemies, that mercy once given multiplies, that the smallest acts of kindness can echo across generations. Today in 2024, there is a small memorial at Fort Oglethorpe, a plaque that reads, in memory of the 127 German women held here in 1945, and in honor of the American soldiers who chose mercy. May we never forget that our common humanity matters more than our differences. Visitors sometimes leave flowers, sometimes small American and German flags side by side, because the story did not end with the war. It continued in classrooms, in letters, in the lives of people who learned that hatred is easy, but mercy requires courage. In every war, there are moments that remind us what it means to be human. This is one of them. Elsa Schneider never saw her brother Friedrich again. He died in a Soviet prison camp in 1946, just months after Germany's surrender. She carried that grief her entire life, but she also carried something else. The memory of a meal that broke her, the kindness of a nurse who had lost a brother, the friendship of a young soldier who saw her as human, the gift of a journal that became a testament. She carried mercy, and she multiplied it. History is written by those who win, but it is remembered by those who learn. The steak and mashed potatoes that made German prisoners cry were not just food. They were a message. Even in hatred, humanity survives. Even across battle lines, mercy exists. And that message, that choice, matters more today than ever. Because we are all someone's enemy in someone else's story. But we are also all human. And that is the truth that survives when everything else falls apart. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more true stories of humanity in the darkest times. Share this with someone who needs to remember that mercy matters, and leave a comment. What small act of kindness changed your life? Dedicated to Elsa Schneider, 1924 to 2018. Ruth Morrison Keller, 1913 to 2005, and all those who chose mercy when hate would have been easier. May their memory be a blessing.